At last, a voice for those who pay big government's bills, not those who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000 member National Taxpayers Union. I'm Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to the latest installment.
Today on Speaking of Taxpayers, we have a familiar guest to Gimme Radio listeners, State Policy Analyst Doug L. Sonati. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, you were on a couple weeks ago talking about state spending transparency and the Show Me the Spending Coalition, and now you're back to talk about some of the recent state-level transparency successes. So why don't you start just talking about, what's been going on the past few weeks with transparency in different states?
I'll do that, and it's really exciting. Things are developing quickly. I think I mentioned last time something that NTU had been involved with. Maryland's spending and transparency website has since gone live in the new year. We're also excited about Virginia's current status. Senator Cuccinelli had sponsored Senate Bill 936, and that is currently awaiting the governor's signature. And that's something that NTU had been actively involved in. So those are two states. We're also excited about progress on two transparency bills in Colorado, one of which would create a general transparency website, another one of which, though, would create transparency sites for each individual school district. So that would be a great way of localizing the benefits. So those are some examples. We also have progress in Iowa, North Dakota, and Tennessee. So those are some things we've been tracking recently.
I've heard that in Colorado, a huge share of expenditures there are devoted to education, something like more than a third?
Right, I believe that's the case. And again, NTU has been very active in that state in promoting this specific legislation. In fact, Josh Coing, State Government Affairs Manager, was able to help in part craft the legislation of Senate Bill 57, sponsored by Senator Harvey. So again, that would be a great way of promoting transparency, but it's also a great example of how taxpayers and citizens in general shouldn't rest just with general transparency on the federal state level, but it's also important to have local transparency.
Yes, I'd heard that the public school establishment was particularly adamant about not getting up these kinds of expenditures because we might find, heaven knows, all kinds of things, money wasted on pointless textbooks,
stickers,
overpaid administrators, who knows what we could find. We certainly might not find the things we want to, which is reading, writing, arithmetic, and those great applied arts that seem to be missing from public schools today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, in this fiscal environment, it's essential to scrutinize every aspect of government spending from the federal level down to the local level. So this is great. It's good news. It's exciting to see this kind of transparency legislation moving forward.
Yeah, and you mentioned that our State Government Affairs Manager, Josh Coing, has been active in helping craft some of the legislation in Colorado. Mm-hmm. He also was out there testifying not too long ago, correct?
That's right. He was doing that. I mentioned Virginia's situation. He was very active there, both in testifying, but also in helping marshal other transparency advocates to convince the Virginia legislature that transparency was in fact a good thing. In Virginia's case, I believe the bill had a fiscal note of $1 million or more associated with the cost of getting a transparency site up and running. Josh and others here at NTU were able to contact State Treasurer Shane Osborne of Nebraska and actually get him to write a letter to the legislators in Virginia explaining, no, this won't cost $1 million. I was able to do it for $38,000. So that's another example of how NTU and its staff has been promoting transparency.
And remember, Gimme Radio listeners, State Treasurer Osborne will be a guest at the upcoming National Taxpayers Conference, June 11th through 13th in Crystal City, right outside of Washington, D.C. Be sure to visit our website to learn details on that.
And also, so there's been another movement lately, kind of transparency related, now that the stimulus some states are standing to receive tens of billions of dollars in federal stimulus funds. Can you tell us more about this recent trend of some states, what states are doing to be more accountable and how they're spending their stimulus money?
Yes. So as taxpayers, many of us might be disappointed, to say the least, about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So the silver lining is that heightened call for transparency. About 541 billion of the 787 billion, or 69% of the federal funds that are being distributed, will be administered by state governments. So that has really heightened, as I said, the call for transparency. The good news is many states have posted some type of recovery site related to their acceptance and distribution of these federal funds. And there are over 30 of those sites available now.
What are some of the states that have posted recovery sites?
Sure. Alabama, Arkansas, Colorado, Delaware, Kansas, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and the list goes on, Wisconsin. So this is great on the one hand, but as our President Dwayne Party's letter to all of the governors recently called for, it's important to have these recovery sites constructed in a way that makes them searchable. The problem is it's very easy to just put up a few links that say, here's the federal site that describes how states are being distributed funds, but then it's possible for state officials to fail to describe in detail how they're actually planning to spend those dollars they receive. So it might, for example, New Mexico's site lists very little, in contrast with New Jersey's recovery site, which actually provides a lot more detailed information about how funds are planning to be spent. So that's really a key distinction. It's not just enough to have a site up that says, here's the amount of money we received from the federal government. It's also important to say in explicit and specific detail, here's how we plan to spend that money.
Just to put this in perspective for listeners, we're talking about a total of roughly $1,700 of stimulus spending for every man, woman, and child to be administered by the states. Now, depending on where you live, your state may be getting more or less money than that per resident, but that is a huge amount. We as taxpayers have every right to see how that money is being spent. That's why it's important for all listeners to insist on accountability in this spending process.
Right, and I mentioned that letter that Dwayne Party had sent to all the state governors. One point he made in that letter is that these states have an obligation not only to their own citizens, but since this money is being received from the federal government and has been collected from taxpayers across the U.S., they actually have an obligation to all U.S. taxpayers. So even if state legislators and officials don't feel an obligation to their own citizens and constituents, by taking federal funding, their constituency has effectively become the entire United States. So that's another reason why it's essential for them to post in detail why they plan to spend the money as they do.
Exactly, and we'd like to point out to Gimme Radio listeners that this letter that NTU President Dwayne Party sent to every governor called for rejecting stimulus funds first. But if a governor or state chooses to accept stimulus funds, then the next best course of action would be to include more transparency. And also this week we had sent a letter. Released a statement applauding two governors who refused stimulus money, Governor Mark Sanford of South Carolina and Texas Governor Rick Perry, who refused part of the stimulus package earmarked for their state.
Right, and even in those instances, I think it's worth noting that both of those governors and both of the states are transparent and actually exemplary out of all the U.S. States, and then also both governors have been very vocal about their promotion of transparency. So it's ironic that the two individuals who would be most likely to steward those funds well are also the ones who are rejecting it.
And equally ironic, the White House has written back the governor of South Carolina, Mark Sanford, saying, you can't turn down the funds we want to send you. You can't apply it to deficit or state debt retirement. Can't do that. We want you to pump it into the economy on worthless projects in the hopes that people won't be looking and the economy will somehow recover some other way and Obama can take credit for that spending. But Sanford is not down for the count. In fact, he has written the president back saying, well, if the money I have to spend on education is something that you're going to require me to dole out to the localities, how about I use it to retire local school bond issues? The president has not answered that yet, but as most listeners would attest, the borrower is servant to the lender. Those of us who have read the Bible have heard that phrase, and obviously Governor Sanford has too.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that everything that you just said ties back to the disadvantages of states receiving federal funds and how that undermines the federalist system that's so beneficial. The system of federalism in which states are able to compete with one another and not cow down really to the dictates of a federal government in areas where that government has no jurisdiction. So.
Okay, so where can Gimme Radio listeners turn to for more information on transparency issues, Doug?
Well, first of all, they should visit showmethespending.com. So that's all one word, showmethespending.com. That's a great place to learn more about and even contribute updates to, since the site is interactive, about transparencies. I'd also encourage them to visit ntu.org, which has a more formal listing of the letters that we've submitted to different to different state legislators and legislatures in favor of transparency, and it also has the testimony that some of our staff have been able to present in promoting accountability. So I'd encourage them to visit showmethespending.com and ntu.org.
And they can also sign up for a weekly e-newsletter if you want to receive weekly transparency updates. You can do that at showmethespending.com as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Doug Elsinati. Keep that flashlight shining on the dark corners of budgets everywhere. You're our hero. We'll welcome you back soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, we're going to be speaking of the stimulus. Not the stimulus package you just heard about, not that untransparent, dark-cornered, budget-busting bill, but rather a no-cost stimulus, a new way and a better way to help our economy grow. It is called the No-Cost Stimulus Act. Is that correct, Natasha?
Yes, it is. The No-Cost Stimulus Act, there were two versions, one introduced by Senator David Vitter of Louisiana, S-570, and Representative Rob Bishop from Utah, H.R. 1431. The No-Cost Stimulus Act of 2009 would open up America's enormous energy resources to development and streamline regulatory hurdles that are confronting businesses. In doing so, it would provide a large economic stimulus without adding to the deficit or spending another dime of existing taxpayer funds.
See, what this bill embodies is the concept that if you just get rid of a lot of the barriers to exploring for new energy resources, you not only get lower energy prices, which is something we all need in this down economy, you also get more revenues because the companies that explore for energy, natural gas, oil, what have you, they pay royalties to the federal government when they go to the outer continental shelf or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and they gladly do it because, of course, as they make money, they pay taxes on those profits. It's not as if they're being punished, as with Obama's windfall profit tax. That's a totally different topic for a totally different show. What we're talking about here is stimulating the economy through cheaper energy prices and helping the federal government close its deficit by finding fresh revenue sources that don't involve raising tax rates.
The Congressional Research Service recently estimated the potential federal revenue from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR, oil development at $191 billion over 30 years. If we apply that same formula to the $107 billion plus barrels of recoverable oil in Anwar, the nearby National Petroleum Reserve, and offshore, that could yield nearly $2 trillion in overall revenue over 30 years. And that would stimulate the economy, wouldn't cost any taxpayers a dime.
Yeah, and the best part of this, of course, is that we can use this to balance the federal budget without burdening businesses or taxpayers. It's not free money, but it is found money in the form of better regulatory relief. And we need to make sure, however, that once this money is discovered, and this is assuming the legislation actually passes, we don't want that money to be squandered on more of President Obama's wish list on health care and alternative energy and the like. What we want here is good old-fashioned economic stimulus by getting government out of the way, not getting government further involved.
We want to point out, though, that there is a provision currently in the No Cost Stimulus Act that would dedicate some of the revenue to development or to subsidies for so-called alternative and renewable programs. We believe the bill would be much improved if that provision was removed, although, overall this is still a better alternative than just taxing people more.
And why in the world would we oppose alternative energy development? Well, the simple answer to that is we don't oppose alternative energy development. We simply don't think government is capable of taking the lead on that kind of development. The last time we saw such an attempt was the Synfuels Corporation back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a Jimmy Carter era relic that spent billions of dollars trying to make an artificial alternative to oil and gasoline, failed to produce a single drop, billions of dollars down the drain. We're very concerned that this could happen again if we let the federal government get too involved in alternative energy development. It is the private sector developing better windmills, developing better solar energy capacity, looking into geothermal and tidal and even micro dams for hydroelectric production. All of these things are what we should be doing rather than providing more government subsidies.
The No Cost Stimulus Act also helps smooth out the regulatory pavement, including nuclear plant licensing, judicial review for energy projects, and lengthy environmental impact statement processes.
That's right, because part of the reason why we keep getting prevented from putting more nuclear power plants online or hydroelectric plants, it's this long, drawn-out process where special interest groups can delay and obfuscate and put up roadblocks to the point where it's no longer economically effective. Well, we can't tolerate that anymore. We not only need energy security, we need decent, stable energy supplies and decent, stable prices to go with them. And this bill is a great start. So, what are those bill numbers again, Natasha?
H.R. 1431 and S. 570, the No Cost Stimulus Act of 2009. It's our legislation of the week.
And if you want more information, including our endorsement letter of the bill, visit us online at ntu.org.
You just heard our legislation of the week, and now it is time to move on to our popular segment, the outrage of the week. Pete?
And this week's outrage is about a whopper of a chopper, the VH-71 presidential helicopter you may have seen in many, many photos and in film footage. Those old helicopters, Marine One, they are old, some of them several decades old, and the federal government has been looking for a replacement for these aircraft. In fact, they're trying to order about 28 new helicopters built by the Lockheed Martin Corporation. Well, as is often the case with government contracts, the upward spiral keeps on going and the delays keep on coming. Originally conceived in 2001 with a price tag of $6.5 billion with a B dollars for 28 new helicopters, the price tag has since doubled to at least $13 billion, and it is now 18 months behind schedule. What in the world are the reasons behind this problem? Well, the designers of the project said they had no idea it would be this difficult to build in new performance specifications for range and carrying more people and flying further and hovering longer than aircraft in the current fleet. They also had to build in security measures to resist things like surface-to-air missiles. They also wanted to add new technologies to make nuclear-proof communication devices. Well, the problem is a lot of these things are already incorporated in the current models that serve the President of the United States and federal dignitaries. Certainly not the range and the hover specifications, but these helicopters have been nuclear-proof for quite a long time. If not nuclear-proof, then at least reasonably protected from them. And we started adding surface-to-air missile protection after 9/11, or maybe even before. It's hard to say because a lot of this is kept secret. The bottom line is this project has gone out of control, and the laws that were supposed to protect taxpayers from this going out of control have failed us. There is a law on the books that says if a given defense project is projected to run 25% over budget, Congress has to review some reports from contract officials and the Secretary of Defense and decide whether the project should continue. Well, that doesn't often happen because there are exceptions to the law. You can change the number of items you want to buy and get under that limit. You can have the Secretary of Defense certify that this project or a given project is urgent for national security. That amounts to a waiver. Problem after problem, and yet the law just doesn't seem to keep up with it. What do you think, Natasha? Is this just another example of the federal government and Congress and other officials abusing their travel privileges?
I think so, Pete. I mean, there have been numerous reports about other congressmen and lawmakers jetting around town. There's a lot of coverage about Nancy Pelosi's private jet. What I think is interesting, too, is the fact that it's multiple helicopters.
Yes, we're talking about...
Excuse me, sorry. Just keep going.
Yes, we're talking about a purchase of 28 helicopters, so right now, per piece, we're talking about $464 million. An incredible price tag, even for a helicopter shielded from nuclear electromagnetic pulses and other items. And to his credit, Barack Obama is saying this VH-71 helicopter was, and I quote, an example of the procurement process gone amok, and we're going to have to fix it. He added that his current helicopter, the Marine One that we often see on TV, seemed perfectly adequate to him. Even the Navy, which is in charge of developing this project, is saying they are not satisfied with the way the costs have been managed. So even though this is currently an outrage to taxpayers, maybe, just maybe, it's an outrage we can head off at the pass and end before more money gets spent. And now, NTU in the news here on Gimme Radio. We're talking about property taxes. You may not be aware that over its 40-year history, the National Taxpayers Union has worked on numerous state and local taxpayer issues, among them the landmark Proposition 13 property tax limit out in California in 1978. You may remember the late, great Howard Jarvis pumping his fist in the air, saying, "I'm mad as H-E double toothpicks, and I'm not going to take it anymore." It touched off a tax revolt that took the country by storm, all the way to the West Coast and the East Coast in Massachusetts and Colorado and Michigan and places all over the country. People were fed up over property taxes, and they did something about it. Is there another tax revolt on the horizon? There may very well be, because once again, the property tax is proving that it is a counter-cyclical tax. What does that mean, folks? It means very simply this: it does not respond to downturns or fluctuations in the economy the way other taxes do. Income tax revenues and income tax burdens tend to go down in a recession because people are making less money. As the same thing with sales taxes, people are spending less. But with property taxes, the rates can go up, the burdens can go up, the assessments may not even go down, even in the middle of a housing trough. And boy, if you don't pay that tax, you're in trouble with your local government. That's what makes the property tax such an awful, unfair burden, especially in these economic times and especially for those on limited income.
As much as 60% of taxable property in the U.S. is overassessed, largely because assessment cycles haven't caught up with the decline in home values, which have been steadily declining for the past few years. The good news, though, is that you can appeal your property taxes, and 1 in 3 is usually successful in doing so. Of course, you could be more successful if you have NTU's book, How to Fight Property Taxes, which is available for sale on our website, www.ntu.org. It includes tips and a how-to guide on how you can successfully appeal your property tax and see a lowering value, perhaps.
I always tell folks to look at the property tax appeals process the way they would look at appealing a parking ticket or some other kind of traffic ticket. You've got to go to court prepared with evidence, not arguments based on fairness of the law or the American Revolution. What kind of evidence do you need to have to appeal your property tax? Really, there are 2 kinds. One, you can appeal based on the accuracy of your own assessment. Does the assessor, in reviewing your rate card, have the proper number of bathrooms down for your house, the proper square footage of inhabitable space? All kinds of features can be overlooked in your home by the assessor that could actually reduce your property tax bill. Some of these errors have been embedded in your property record for years. You may not have noticed it, especially if you end up escrowing your property taxes through your mortgage payments and you have your mortgage company pay it. You really don't have an incentive to look at the fine print of your assessment and figure out, is the thing at its base actually correct? And you can do that by going to the assessor's office, asking for your property card and any worksheets associated with it. That will allow you to look at the assumptions that went into your assessment and check to be sure that they're accurate.
Yes, and we bring this up in the NTU in the news segment, of course, because it has been in the news lately. Fortunately, property taxes are receiving more attention, and a Kiplinger's Personal Finance article was citing some NTU information, and that you might have seen on your local TV station this past Tuesday. The story appeared in more than 100 local news segments about how to fight your property taxes. So look out for that, and if it hasn't come to your town yet, it probably will soon.
And you may be wondering, what's the second method you can use to appeal your property tax? Well, that is the comparable assessment method. Is your house assessed at a decent level relative to other homes with the same features in your neighborhood? You may be quite surprised to find out that they are not, that your house is assessed way higher than others in the neighborhood. How do you review that? By viewing the property cards of other homes around you. You simply account for the age of the homes, the features of the homes, select anywhere from 6 to 10 comparable records, and find out, how do you measure up? If you think that you are being overassessed, then you file for an appeal. Some people will allow you to do it by mail. Other jurisdictions, you've got to appeal your assessment before a formal grievance board. But in any case, if you take an afternoon to research your own assessment, you spend perhaps a Saturday and a Sunday preparing an appeal, you may be able to win hundreds of dollars in reductions on your assessment. It's a very valuable thing to do, and we have step-by-step instructions on how to do it in our brochure, How to Fight Property Taxes.
And once again, you can get that on our website, www.ntu.org. This just about brings us to the end of Speaking of Taxpayers this week. Thank you for joining us.
And remember, Gimme Radio listeners, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And the way we speak truth to power is through speaking of taxpayers. I'm